At the end of the last paper, we asked the question how to effectively combine type 1 and type 2 adaptations. Now, in this paper, we are attempting to answer that question. Let's look at type 1 and type 2 adaptation in the context of two of the variables that we deal with in urban development as well as in real life. One is uncertainty. So we mark x-axis in this graph with uncertainty and the y-axis with urgency. Now, if we think a little bit and carefully look at our candidates' adaptation of type 1 and type 2, we can immediately see that type 2 adaptation actions have very high degree of uncertainty compared to type 1 actions, whereas their urgency is relatively low. Because by definition, we are dealing with adaptation to the future situation. So we have a little bit of a slack regarding time. However, we cannot predict the future accurately, so we are beset with a lot of uncertainty. On the other hand, if you look at type 1 actions addressing adaptation deficits, the opposite is true. We have a sense of urgency because these are actions that we have to do in order to address current issues. The level of uncertainty is, relatively speaking, low compared to type 2 adaptations. Now, when we try to combine type 1 and type 2 adaptation, our situation ends up being a place where nobody really want to be because now we are combining high uncertainty with high level of urgency. So are there actions that you can reasonably do in this kind of domain? It almost sounds as an oxymoron. Most of the secondary cities in the global south today are focusing almost exclusively on adaptation deficits, or they are doing a lot of type 1 actions for the reasons we discussed in the previous video, like the sense of urgency, political pressure, etc. Whereas many of the mature cities are addressing adaptation gaps. They are preparing for the future. They do not have too many adaptation deficits to speak of. Now, our proposal was to move SCGS from addressing only type 1 to a situation where we address both type 1 and type 2 adaptations. Once we do that, it becomes immediately clear that SCGS has to address high level of uncertainty combined with high level of urgency. Now, this is a very difficult situation. So, what we decided to do was to look at other domains, other disciplines, to check whether they have encountered similar problems and if they had, what kind of answers did they come up with. In our explorations, we encountered the domain of software development of all places. In software development, in the early periods, people were following what they call predictive approach. And this approach works quite well when you have relatively low level of uncertainty combined with relatively low level of urgency. So you can plan and do stuff quite well then. However, increasingly, software developers realize that kind of projects they have to do are not in this predictive domain. They have a combination of high uncertainty combined with high urgency. So they proposed this interesting new approach called adaptive approach. Now, if you compare this graph, which I got inspiration from software development, you can see that this adaptive approach is placed in the exact same place in the previous graph where we argued that we want to have SCGS in. Software people call this approach agile methodology. So we wanted to look a little bit deeply into this agile methodology. Agile methodology is a very well developed discipline in software industry, and there are some other domains also where agile methodology is widely used, like automobile manufacturing industry, supply chain management, etc. But we focused on the software development because that is where this approach is most well developed. When we examined the literature, there is a whole bunch of it in the software development domain. We realized that there is a lot of stuff that we can learn from. So we asked the question, can we sort of translate the best practices that software developers follow, like 12 agile principles that is written in the Agile Manifesto, into something that is usable in the urban development? Of course, the scales of time, scales of resources are quite different. But what we realized and what we present in this paper is that indeed we can translate the agile approach into the domain of urban development quite successfully. And we also see that there is quite a lot of literature in the domain of urban adaptation and urban development that support this idea of 12 urban agile principles. However, there is no document where they cover all the 12 principles. So, what we did in this paper was to make the case for introducing the agile development in the domain of urban development and urban adaptation. In the process, we also realized that these 12 agile principles can be summarized into what we call 4 essential objectives of agile urban development. Now, in the next part, I want to show only one aspect of this new agile idea of urban adaptation. That is transforming our adaptation process from a so called traditional or waterfall approach, where we take quite a lot of time systematically addressing first the requirements, then the plan and design, then the implementation, then monitoring, and then maintenance. In the new agile approach, we work in a cycle where we revisit each of the steps in implementing a project within a very short period of time. And then we continue traveling in this circle over and over again. More importantly, the amount of time we spend in completing one circle is relatively short compared to the completion of the waterfall approach. Of course, the time scales in software development and time scales in urban adaptation are quite different from each other. However, in this paper, we argue that this new agile approach is a worthwhile candidate to consider in urban adaptation to transform it into a more viable endeavor.